Two children lost in the burning desert for 4 endless days. Lips cracked, skin blistered, and hope fading with every step. Just when death seemed certain, a lone cowboy named Jace Callahan appeared on his black Mustang, Onyx. But was he a savior? Or just another stranger in a cruel world? Where are you watching this story from right now? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. Wishing you a beautiful day filled with hope and kindness. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story that might touch your heart. The Mojave Desert stretched out like an ocean of heat beneath the late summer sun, a merciless expanse where even the hardiest plants shriveled into brittle skeletons. Wind pushed across the flats, carrying dust that clung to skin and throat like chalk, and far in the distance the red cliffs beyond, Red Rock, Nevada, shimmered as though aflame. The small town crouched at the foot of the range, but for two children lost in this wasteland, it might as well have been on the moon. 8-year-old Lydia Harrow trudged forward, her legs trembling, her dress torn at the hem. Her pale hair, matted with sweat and grit, clung to her temples. She had freckles across her nose that might have made her look mischievous once, but now her face was drawn and cracked from the sun. In her arms she half carried her younger brother, Eli, 5 years old, his body slack against her chest. His lips were pale, his breath shallow, his eyes half closed. He had been murmuring nonsense a few hours earlier, words mixed with feverish dreams. But now he was frighteningly quiet. They had been walking since dawn. The canteen their mother had pressed into Lydia's hands had run dry that morning. Lydia had tried everything, catching dew from cactus pads, chewing tiny pieces of prickly pear fruit, even though they stung her mouth, pressing Eli's lips with the last damp cloth so he could taste moisture. It wasn't enough. She had promised her mother with her last look that she would keep Eli safe, but the desert stripped promises as easily as flesh. Lydia eased Eli down beside a slab of stone that offered a thin strip of shade. She sat beside him, her chest heaving, eyes burning from the salt of her own sweat. "Don't leave me, Eli," she whispered, brushing his damp curls back. The words cracked like dry wood. She tried to hum the lullaby their mother used to sing, but her voice broke and fear pressed heavier on her ribs. She was a child carrying the weight of an adult's vow, and her strength was almost gone. Then she saw movement. At first it was only a ripple in the glare, a mirage conjured by thirst. But the shadow grew, dark and steady, resolving into the tall figure of a horse cresting the rise. Its coat shone black as obsidian beneath the sun, mane tossing with each deliberate stride. Riding astride was a man broad-shouldered and upright, his outline cutting sharp against the horizon. Lydia's heart lurched between terror and hope. The horse came closer. Onyx, a black Mustang stallion, stood a solid 15 hands high, with shoulders deep and strong, muscles sliding like coiled rope under his coat. A faint star marked his brow, and a small notch scarred one ear, hinting at past battles. His amber eyes were steady, not wild. They flicked toward the children with the watchfulness of a creature used to danger, but capable of choosing gentleness. Lydia shrank back, clutching Eli, but she noticed how the stallion's gait slowed, as if instinctively careful, near fragile things. The rider swung down. His boots sank into sand with a heavy sound, and when he straightened, the sun struck his face beneath the brim of a weathered hat. Jace Callahan was a man who looked as though he belonged to this desert. Tall, 6'2", shoulders broad from years of ranch labor, his dust-colored duster flapping around him. His hair was black, cropped short, but curling slightly at the edges, and a jaw darkened by stubble framed a mouth that seemed more used to silence than talk. A faint scar traced his chin, the kind left by an accident with a rope or a barbed wire fence. His eyes, an arresting river green, carried the weight of old grief, softened by something steadier. Patience. Those who knew him in Red Rock called him quiet, sometimes distant, but always dependable. The man who came when colts were born in storms, who never asked payment if a neighbor's roof blew off, who buried his pain in work and the wild miles he rode with Onyx. Jace removed his hat slowly and knelt, his large frame folding with deliberate care so he wouldn't tower over them. "Afternoon," he said, voice low and even. "Name's Jace Callahan. This here's Onyx." His eyes rested on Eli, gauging the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Your brother needs water." Lydia staggered upright, spreading her arms as if her small body could block him. Her cracked voice rasped, "We don't talk to strangers." She meant it fierce, but it came out weak. Jace nodded, as though she had spoken wisdom. "Your mama taught you right," he replied simply. He unslung his canteen, holding it where she could see. "But if we don't give him this now, he won't see another sunrise." When Jace tried to tip the water toward Eli's lips, Lydia lunged and grabbed for it, panic sharpening her movements. "Give it to me," she cried, desperate to drench her brother's mouth. Jace's hand tightened, not rough, but unyielding. "Not like that," he said firmly. "Too much at once will kill him faster." The authority in his tone made Lydia freeze. For the first time, she believed he knew what he was doing. He tipped a few drops onto Eli's cracked lips. Nothing happened, then the boy twitched, coughing, eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Jace coaxed a few more drops, patient, until a small sound rattled from Eli's chest. Breath. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. She sank to her knees, whispering, "He wasn't breathing." Jace adjusted Eli gently in the blanket he had pulled from his saddlebag. "He is now." Lydia wiped her face with her arm, trembling. "If you hurt him," she whispered, her last weapon of courage, "I'll find the biggest rock in the desert." Jace's mouth curved faintly, not in mockery, but respect. "Fair," he said. "If I fail him, you throw it." Onyx lowered his massive head and blew a soft breath across Eli's hair, as though offering his own assurance. Lydia stiffened, then stared in wonder. The horse's eyes held no threat, only calm, steady presence. For the first time, she let herself believe. Jace lifted Eli with practiced arms. The boy was so light it made his jaw clench in anger at the desert's cruelty. He set Eli sideways before the saddle horn, wrapped the blanket snug, and tied a strap gently to hold him steady. "You'll ride behind him," Jace told Lydia. "Hold him close. If he sways, you keep him upright. Onyx knows the trail." Lydia looked at the stallion's broad back, fear tightening her chest. "I've never ridden." Jace extended his hand, scarred, calloused, strong. "Then today you'll learn. He won't let you fall." She placed her hand in his. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her behind Eli. She wrapped her thin arms around her brother, feeling the fragile rise and fall of his chest. Jace mounted behind them, his weight steadying the saddle, his arm bracing around the children. Onyx flicked his ears back, listening to his rider's low command, then stepped forward at a smooth, careful pace. The horse's gait rolled like a cradle, soothing even in the heat. Jace kept one arm firm around the children, his other hand guiding the reins, eyes scanning horizon and sky. He did not waste words. His presence was its own promise. They moved west. Clouds gathered along the blackbrush hills, throwing rare patches of shade across the burning flats. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, the first hint of water. Lydia pressed her cheek to Eli's back, relief loosening something clenched tight for 4 endless days. She dared whisper, "We're going home, Eli." Jace heard, though he did not answer, his jaw set, his eyes forward. For him, the word home was complicated. But as Onyx carried them toward Dry Creek, and as Lydia's grip around her brother tightened with renewed hope, he felt the stir of something he had not allowed in years, the possibility that saving others might yet save a part of himself. Twilight descended over the Mojave with the slow weariness of a giant laying down its burden. The desert that had glared mercilessly all day softened under the bruised purple of the sky, the air cooling just enough for breath to no longer scrape raw. Jace Callahan urged Onyx forward at a measured pace, careful of the fragile lives clinging to the saddle. Lydia Harrow sat stiff-backed, her thin arms wound tightly around her brother Eli, her cheek pressed to his small chest so she could count each shallow rise and fall. Jace rode close behind, his broad frame steadying the children, one hand on the reins, the other braced protectively against Lydia's shoulder. The horse's ears flicked back to the rhythm of his rider's low words, and though Onyx was strong, even he snorted with fatigue. It had been a punishing ride across open ground, and Jace stopped twice to let him breathe, to wet his lips with water and check Eli's pulse. Every pause deepened the truth. This rescue was balanced on a knife's edge. By the time they reached the cluster of cottonwoods that signaled Dry Creek, shadows had thickened and the air smelled faintly of water and loam. Nestled against a rise of stone sat a log cabin with a wide porch and smoke curling from its chimney. Lamps flickered warmly behind windows, and from the corral came the soft shuffle of two mares shifting in the dusk. For Lydia, who had spent 4 days in a furnace of dust and terror, the sight was both miracle and danger. It looked too safe, too much like the kind of dream that vanished when she blinked. She clutched Eli tighter, her eyes darting toward Jace as though he might disappear too. The cabin door opened and Clara Vaughn stepped onto the porch. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with a straightness in her spine that spoke of discipline. Her dark hair, threaded with strands of silver, was pulled back into a braid, and her plain blue cotton dress was half covered by a flour-dusted apron. Years of labor had carved fine lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth, and grief had deepened them. Her husband had died in a mine accident 3 winters past, leaving her alone to keep hearth and house. But though sorrow had hardened her edges, it had also honed compassion into something deliberate. Her amber-brown eyes narrowed when she saw the strangers at her gate. "Jace!" she called, her voice strong, practical, a woman accustomed to commanding her own small kingdom. "What have you brought me now?" Jace swung down, boots crunching gravel. He carried Eli as gently as one might lift a lamb, though the boy was frighteningly weightless. "Children," Jace said simply. "Lost. Their wagon went under in a wash. This one's burning up." He did not ask, only moved toward the porch, and Clara's first instinct was to protest. Her home was small, her larder stretched thin, her nights too quiet to carry new burdens. But when she saw Eli's face slack with fever and Lydia's eyes wide with defiance, something in her chest cracked. "Bring him inside," Clara ordered at last, stepping back. "But if you think you're dropping them here and vanishing into the hills, Jace Callahan, you're mistaken." The cabin smelled of stew and baking bread. Jace laid Eli on a couch near the hearth, and Clara was at once bustling, fetching a basin of water and cloths, her hands firm but careful. She pressed Lydia to sit, though the girl stood like a sentinel beside her brother. "He needs cool water in sips," Clara murmured, half to herself, half to reassure Lydia. "We'll keep the fever from taking him." When she reached to brush dirt from Lydia's cheek, the child flinched hard, her shoulders hunched like a trapped animal. Clara paused, then sat back, deliberately tearing a piece of bread from a fresh loaf and biting into it before handing the rest to Lydia. "Safe," she said simply. The girl stared, then snatched it and ate, suspicion intact but cracked. Outside, Onyx drank deeply at the trough, his black coat damp and gleaming in the lamplight. He lifted his head once, ears swiveling at the new voices, then settled to graze, his presence a steady silhouette against the falling night. Lydia noticed the horse through the window, and thought, strangely, that the animal's calm steadiness made her less afraid of the people around her. Morning came with the scent of coffee and oats drifting through the cabin. Eli slept heavily, but color had returned faintly to his cheeks. Lydia woke curled beside him in a bed softer than she remembered ever having, blinking in the pale light spilling across the quilt. Clara was already moving briskly in the kitchen, hair tied back tighter, apron freshly laundered. She greeted Lydia not with cooing sweetness, but with respect. "You kept him alive out there," she said, while setting a bowl before the girl. "Most grown men couldn't. That makes you braver than most." Lydia, still wary, ate slowly, her eyes never straying far from her brother. Later that day, Jace saddled Onyx and rode into Red Rock for supplies. The small town was awake with its usual bustle, children darting past the mercantile, miners tramping toward the saloon, women haggling over flour at the general store. When Jace stepped into the sheriff's office, the news traveled faster than dust on wind. Sheriff Elias Hayes, a man in his 50s with a heavy middle and a bristling mustache, listened with his elbows propped on the desk. His eyes, sharp beneath his brim, studied Jace. "You did right not leaving them to the coyotes," Hayes admitted, "but don't think this ends with you bringing them in. If they've got blood kin'll come calling, and law'll side with them no matter what's in your heart." Jace's jaw set. "And if there isn't any kin? Then maybe the court lets you keep them, but don't count on mercy if a relative shows up waving papers. Hayes leaned, back sighing. You lost a sister once, didn't you? You know how the law works. It don't care who kept watch at night. It only cares about blood. Jace left with his jaw tight, the weight of the warning heavy as his saddlebags. By sundown, whispers trailed behind him at the mercantile, the blacksmith's wife murmuring about Jace's strays, the clerk shaking his head at the thought of one man and a widow suddenly raising 2 children. Admiration was not enough to drown gossip. Back at Dry Creek, Clara scrubbed Eli's brow with steady hands, her movements efficient, practiced. A woman used to nursing others through hard times. Lydia sat nearby, her small body still taut with suspicion. At one point, Clara tried to hum while mending a shirt, and the soft tune, faltering, tired, but real, made Lydia's throat ache with memory. She wanted to mistrust, but the sound wrapped her in something fragile. That evening, the desert cooled into lavender dusk. Lydia slipped onto the porch steps while Onyx grazed a few yards away, his dark form shifting against the horizon. She whispered to the horse, voice so low even she barely heard it. You wouldn't let him hurt us, would you? Onyx blew out a long breath, flicked his ears, and bent to the grass again. It was no answer, but her heart read it as yes. Behind her, Clara sat with her mending, needle flashing in the last of the light. She glanced at Lydia, then spoke without looking up. This house has been too quiet too long. Maybe it's time it learned the sound of laughter again. Lydia hugged her knees tighter. Trust would not come in a rush, but warmth crept into her chest, the first fragile ember of belonging. For the first time since the wreck, she thought maybe her mother's promise, that someone would keep them safe, was being kept in ways she had not expected. The desert mornings around Dry Creek carried a different kind of light, thin and gold, spilling through the cottonwoods and pooling on the porch like a promise that the night had kept them safe. For days after Jace carried Lydia and Eli into the cabin, time seemed to move slowly. The silence of the ranch broken only by the shuffle of boots, the scrape of spoons, or the gentle breathing of the children as they slept. Yet, little by little, new sounds emerged, faint at first, then steadier. A hesitant question, the whisper of small feet across wooden floors, the sigh of Eli's laughter breaking out like a bird startled into flight. It was not sudden transformation, but something quieter, the slow stitching of life back into the fabric of a house that had been still too long. Eli was the first to mend, though his recovery was not swift as a miracle. At 5 years old, his body drew strength from broth and rest, yet weakness still lingered in his limbs. When Jace showed him how to scatter corn for the hens, Eli stumbled more than once, clutching the edge of the trough when his breath failed him, but his grin remained stubborn, freckles bright against skin still thin from hunger. Clara, wiping her hands on her apron, would scold gently, telling him to sit before he fell over. And Eli would shake his head, whispering, "Pa Jace said I could help." The name slipped out one morning when his voice was half asleep, and he turned crimson when Clara raised an eyebrow. Jace said nothing, only ruffled the boy's hair with a calloused hand, and went back to mending the harness, but his green eyes softened for the rest of the day. Lydia was slower to trust. She never let Eli out of her sight, her gaze sharp as a hawk's whenever Clara carried him to the porch for air. If Eli coughed in the night, Lydia was there with a hand against his chest, counting breaths. The memories of the desert were too near, the fear of losing him still clawing at her chest. When Clara offered her bread one morning, Lydia refused until Clara calmly broke off a piece and bit into it first, then slid the rest across the table. Only then did Lydia reach out, eyes never leaving the woman's face. Even so, Clara saw glimpses. A fleeting smile when Eli dropped corn all over the yard and the hens went flapping after it, or a laugh caught in Lydia's throat when Onyx leaned down and blew warm air across her tangled hair. Whenever Clara or Jace noticed, Lydia shut herself down again, lips pressed tight, as if joy were a secret she must not share. Onyx became an unexpected ally in the children's healing. The black Mustang, strong and patient, seemed to sense the fragility of his new companions. When Jace lifted Lydia into the saddle one morning, intending only to let her sit, Onyx stood utterly still, ears flicking backward as if waiting for her heartbeat to slow. Lydia's hands trembled against his mane, but after a long breath, she dared to stroke the curve of his neck. The horse, shifted only slightly, a living wall beneath her, and something in Lydia's shoulders eased. Later, Jace found her sneaking out to the corral with a crust of bread, holding it out shyly. Onyx took it with careful lips, and Lydia's eyes widened in wonder, a bond wordless yet true. Clara watched all this with a heart caught between grief and gratitude. Since her husband's death in the mine, the cabin had echoed with silence, each day measured by chores and the ticking of the mantel clock. Now the rooms filled with voices, Eli asking endless questions about saddles and ropes, Lydia reading aloud haltingly from one of the few children's books Clara had kept. The laughter was not constant. Sometimes it faltered into fear, but it existed, and it carried a strange healing weight. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, Clara paused at the sound of Eli's giggle drifting across the yard as Lydia chased him in circles. She stood still, clothespin in hand, and for the first time in years, tears burned behind her eyes, not from sorrow, but from something that felt perilously like hope. In town, whispers grew. When Clara took Lydia with her to the mercantile for flour, the girl shrank behind her skirt as two women eyed her openly. "That's one of the strays Jace found," one muttered, loud enough to carry. Clara straightened her back, chin high, and laid a hand on Lydia's shoulder, not to push her forward, but to steady her. Lydia pressed closer, her eyes darting to the door, as if fearing someone might come to pull Eli away in her absence. Clara bent and murmured, "You're safe. Don't mind their tongues. People always talk when they don't understand." Lydia nodded, though her grip on Clara's apron remained white-knuckled until they were back on the wagon. At the ranch, evenings gathered them close around the fire. Clara ladled stew into bowls, Eli perched on the edge of his chair beside Jace, and Lydia sat opposite, her spoon moving slowly as she listened more than she ate. Jace, usually silent, began to speak more, telling short stories of trail rides, of nights under stars when coyotes howled and the fire was the only shield. Clara added memories of her husband's laughter, softened by time, into something almost sweet. For the children, these stories were like threads weaving them into a larger fabric, a life that might stretch beyond the terror of the desert. Yet when Clara tucked Lydia into bed afterward, the girl whispered, "If we laugh too loud, will it disappear?" Clara knelt, pressing a kiss to her brow. "No, child, laughter doesn't steal love away. It invites it to stay." But Lydia's eyes remained wide long after the lamp was dimmed. Nightmares still came. Eli woke once crying that his mother had left him in the sand, his fists clutching at the quilt. Clara lifted him into her lap, rocking gently, humming until his sobs slowed. Lydia, wide-eyed in the next bed, whispered, "I'll never let go, Eli, never." Jace, leaning in the doorway, felt the memory of his sister's fever press into him like a scar reopened, and for a moment he closed his eyes, breathing hard against the ache. When Clara looked up and met his gaze across the lamplight, neither spoke, but the understanding between them deepened, the recognition of wounds that could not be erased, only carried together. One night, after the children had finally drifted into uneasy sleep, Jace stepped onto the porch. The desert stretched dark and endless, stars burning cold and sharp above. Clara joined him, a shawl around her shoulders, her braid loosened by the long day. She handed him a cup of coffee without a word. For a long time they stood side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy, but companionable. When the coyotes called from the ridge, Clara whispered, "They've brought the house back to life." Jace glanced at the window where Lydia and Eli slept inside, then back at the horizon. He did not answer, but he set the cup down and pulled his coat from his shoulders, draping it over hers. Clara looked at him, surprise softening into gratitude, and in that simple act, something shifted. Two people, bound by separate griefs, finding that the presence of another might steady the load. Yet even with laughter creeping back into their days, shadows remained. Lydia startled at every knock on the door, clutching Eli as if someone might come to claim him. Eli clung to Jace's leg whenever he saddled Onyx to ride fence, begging, "Don't go too far." In their eyes lived the memory of loss too raw to fade quickly. But within the walls of Dry Creek Ranch, there was bread baking, chores shared, stories told by firelight, and the hesitant sound of children's laughter, a fragile but undeniable proof that even broken hearts could find warmth again. Morning at Dry Creek broke with the sound of chickens scratching in the yard and the smell of Clara's bread cooling on the windowsill, the kind of quiet beginning that made it hard to believe storms could gather under a sky so wide and blue. Lydia and Eli were at the porch steps, Eli rubbing the sleep from his eyes while Lydia kept him close, her small frame straight as a guard. Jace stood by the corral brushing down Onyx, the stallion's dark coat gleaming, his head tossing gently with pleasure at the rough strokes of the brush. It was a morning like any other since laughter had returned to the ranch, but before the sun had climbed high, the rhythm of their world shifted. A rider came down the track from Red Rock, and with him came the shadow of trouble. The man was Silas Harrow, the children's uncle on their father's side, though little of family showed in his bearing. He was in his late 50s, lean but wiry, his frame hardened by years on the frontier, yet worn by whiskey and dust. His gray hair was slicked back beneath a black hat, his coat heavy despite the desert heat, and at his side rode a younger man, sharp-featured, dressed in a brown suit with a briefcase strapped behind the saddle. This companion was introduced curtly as Mr. Lowell, a lawyer from Carson City, his spectacles flashing in the sun, his voice clipped and formal. Silas's eyes, pale gray and cold, measured the ranch with the same dispassion a butcher might grant a carcass, not a trace of warmth in them. He dismounted slowly, boots striking the earth like verdicts. From his pocket he withdrew folded papers, edges stiff and stamped with the seal of the county clerk. "I have come for my brother's children," he announced, his tone loud enough to carry across the yard. "By blood and by law, they belong with me. The guardianship will be entered into court, and their inheritance near the river will fall under my care until they are of age." Jace came from the corral, brushing dust from his hands, his shoulders squared, green eyes narrowed but steady. "You have no right to take them from the only home they've known since the desert tried to claim them," he said, his voice quiet but firm, the kind that carried weight without rising. Silas's thin mouth twisted into a smile without humor. He snapped the papers open, the lawyer stepping closer as if to add weight to the gesture. "This is notarized and proper. Kindness does not undo law. You think a cowboy's pity can stand against ink and signatures? These children are Harrows, and the land their parents held, good fertile land by the river, will not rot under strangers when I am here to see it put to use." Clara stepped forward then, her dark braid catching light in the wind, her apron still dusted with flour. "These children are not strangers to us," she said, her voice low but strong. "They have been fed at my table, slept beneath my roof, laughed again within these walls. If neighbors see me feed a hungry child, they call it mercy, not theft." She placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder, drawing her back when the girl took an instinctive step toward Eli. Lydia's eyes were wide, her face pale, but recognition flashed in them. She remembered this man's voice from long ago, arguments outside her father's house, the way he had shouted about land and debts. She gripped Eli's hand until his knuckles whitened, whispering, "Stay behind me," as though she could shield him with her own small frame. Onyx, restless in the corral, let out a sharp snort, stamping the ground as if he too sensed the wrongness. His ears pinned back, eyes fixed on Silas in a way that made the lawyer glance nervously over his shoulder. The news spread through Red Rock before evening. At the saloon, men argued heatedly, some insisting blood must come before sentiment, others swearing that Jace and Clara had given those children more love than Silas ever would. At the mercantile, Mrs. Patterson told anyone who would listen that Clara had saved the children's souls, while the blacksmith, Mr. Jenkins, muttered that the law was plain and it would do no good to fight it. Even Pastor Weller, a man of balance, preached that God honored both justice and mercy, though which should prevail here he dared not say. The next day Jace and Clara brought the children into town to meet with Sheriff Hayes. The sheriff sat behind his desk, spectacles perched low, as he read the papers Silas had left for filing. Hayes was a man in his 50s, broad around the middle with a bristling mustache, and his eyes were steady, though troubled as he looked up. "The documents are valid," he said slowly. "By the letter of the law, Silas can press his claim in court, and chances are he'll win. But the law is one thing, what's right is another. If Silas seeks to use the children for land, that will come to light, and testimony from townsfolk can weigh heavy." Lydia clutched Clara's arm as she listened, her chest tight with fear. That night, Back at Dry Creek, she could not sleep. At every creak of the cabin, she sat up, convinced Silas was at the door. At one point, she dragged Eli under the quilt, whispering fiercely, "Don't let him see us. If we hide, he cannot take us." Eli trembled, his small hand gripping hers, and Clara sat beside them, with tears burning in her eyes, unable to promise what her heart longed to. On the porch, Jace stood in the shadows, arms folded, his gaze locked on the horizon. Onyx shifted in the corral, tossing his mane, stamping as though restless with his master's unease. Jace knew Hayes had spoken truth. By the law's weight, Silas held advantage. But law did not measure the nights Clara had soothed Eli's cries, or the way Lydia's laughter had broken the silence of grief, or the bond already rooted here. Those things could not be sealed by ink or witnessed by clerks, but they were real as the ache in his chest. He swore, silently, that no paper, no greedy uncle, would undo what had been built at Dry Creek. He would fight for it, fight for them, with everything he was. The day of the hearing dawned with a strange stillness over Red Rock, the kind of silence that made even the birds hesitant to sing. The courthouse, a modest brick and timber building, with whitewashed columns weathered by wind and dust, had never seen such anticipation. Wagons lined the street, horses shifted and snorted, and neighbors filled the benches inside long before the judge arrived. Word had spread fast that Silas Harrow meant to use the law to take Lydia and Eli away. And though the case was called a hearing of urgency, it carried the weight of a trial. Jace Callahan arrived with Clara beside him, Lydia clinging tightly to her hand, while Eli pressed close against Jace's side. Onyx was tied outside by the rail, the black Mustang tossing his head and stamping the ground as though the unease of his master had passed straight into his blood. Inside, the children's small shoes clattered softly on the polished floorboards as the crowd turned to watch. Some nodded with sympathy, others shook their heads with doubt, and the air filled with whispers like dry leaves rattling in the wind. Judge Horace Delaney presided, a tall man in his 60s with a stern, weathered face and eyes the color of slate. Known for his strict devotion to law, he had lived long enough in frontier towns to understand that paper and precedent did not always align with truth. His gavel struck once, the sound echoing against the high beams, and the room fell silent. Silas Harrow sat at the petitioner's table, his angular frame wrapped in a black suit despite the summer heat. His pale gray eyes gleamed with a confidence sharpened by arrogance. And at his side was Mr. Lowell, the young lawyer he had brought from Carson City. Lowell's hair was slicked back, his spectacles flashing in the light, his expression composed as he arranged papers in neat stacks like weapons laid in a row. Lowell rose first, bowing slightly to the judge before speaking in his crisp, deliberate voice. "Your Honor, the matter before us is clear. My client, Mr. Silas Harrow, is the sole surviving brother of the children's late father. By statute, guardianship falls to the nearest blood relative. It is a duty he does not take lightly. These children belong with family, and though sentiment is touching, the law must prevail." A murmur of approval ran through part of the crowd. The blacksmith Jenkins nodded firmly, while Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile pressed her lips together in disapproval. When it was Clara's turn, she stood slowly, her gray dress plain but pressed, her braid wound tight around her head, her hands trembling only once before she steadied them. Her voice was soft at first, but grew as she spoke. "Your Honor, I am not of their blood. I cannot claim ties by statute. But I have been their mother in every way that matters. I have sat by their beds when nightmares woke them. I have fed them at my table. I have taught them laughter again after grief silenced. Their hearts. A guardian must care not only for land or inheritance, but for life itself. My neighbor Silas has never once asked after their health. He has only asked after their father's river property." Silas smirked and leaned back, whispering to his lawyer. Lowell rose again, countering with calm precision. "Such words are heartfelt, but they do not change the fact that the law is plain. Mercy and affection cannot annul legal duty." Witnesses were called. Mrs. Patterson testified that she had seen Lydia and Eli grow stronger, laughing among the apple trees behind her store. Doc Murphy swore they had been frail and near death until Clara nursed them back to health. Sheriff Hayes, standing stiff in his uniform, admitted the papers were valid, but spoke bluntly that he believed Silas sought land, not love. Each word seemed to tip the balance, yet Lowell countered with precedent and statute until the air grew heavy with inevitability. Then Judge Delaney called the children forward. Clara bent low, smoothing Lydia's hair, whispering, "You are safe. Just speak truth." Jace crouched, placing a broad hand over Eli's small shoulder, steadying him with quiet strength. Lydia rose first, her chin high despite the tremor in her lips. She walked to the stand, her voice thin but unwavering. "Your Honor, my uncle does not want us because he loves us. I heard him tell his men by the fire that once he got our land, he would send us away to an orphanage. He called us burdens." A collective gasp swept through the room. Silas half rose, his face flushing, snapping. "Lies from a child's imagination." But Judge Delaney's gavel cracked down, silencing him. Lydia's eyes shimmered with tears, yet she pressed on. "Pa Jace saved us in the desert. Clara makes us feel safe. They sing to us. They hold us when we're afraid. They are our family. Please don't let him take us." Eli stepped forward, his hand clutching Jace's, his voice no louder than a whisper, but carrying clear across the hall. "I want to stay with them. Uncle Silas makes me scared. I don't want to go." Then, as if the weight of truth demanded it, he looked up at the judge and added, "Pa Jace takes care of me. He's my papa now." The words caught in Jace's chest like fire, and for a moment he could not breathe. All eyes turned to Jace when the judge called him next. He rose slowly, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, his voice low and rough with memory. "Your Honor, I lost my sister to fever when I was a younger man. I stood by her bed and could do nothing, and that failure has haunted me every day since. When I found these children in the desert, I swore no child would slip away again if I could stop it. At first, I thought it was duty, but it has become more. These children have healed me as much as I have helped them. They are not of my blood, but they are my life. I cannot let them be torn away." He faltered then, his words catching, and Clara stepped closer, laying a hand lightly on his arm. Lydia's eyes met his, shining with trust, and he straightened, his voice firming. "If you call this defiance, then so be it. But if you call it love, then let them stay." The room held still, neighbors divided, some nodding in agreement, others uneasy with the weight of law. Judge Delaney leaned forward, his hands steepled, his gaze sweeping from Silas's cold gray eyes to the children pressed close against Clara and Jace. His voice, when it came, carried both the weight of law and the tremor of conscience. The law must serve the living. Guardianship requires more than blood. It requires care and intent. It is the judgment of this court that Silas Harrow's claim is denied. Custody is granted to Jace Callahan and Clara Vaughn. For a breath, no one moved. Then Mrs. Patterson began to clap, her hands trembling, and slowly the sound spread. Some faces remained stiff, Jenkins among them, but one by one the town rose, applause filling the chamber. Lydia sobbed into Clara's skirt. Eli clapped his small hands once before burying his face against Jace's chest. Jace bent low, wrapping his arms around them both, and for the first time in years he felt the heavy scar of grief lighten under the weight of belonging. Silas stormed from the courtroom, his lawyer trailing after him, muttering threats that fell flat against the rising sound of joy. Outside, as the family stepped into the sun, Onyx tossed his head, letting out a sharp neigh that echoed across the street like a trumpet of victory. The people of Red Rock stood with them, not only by affection, but by witness, and for the first time the children knew that the law itself had chosen love over greed. They walked down the courthouse steps hand in hand, no longer bound by fear, but bound instead by the unshakable truth that Dry Creek was their home. The gavel's echo had barely faded from the courtroom walls when Sheriff Hayes stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his broad hand clamping firmly around Silas Harrow's arm. The gray-eyed man who had carried himself with arrogance just hours before now stumbled, his papers falling in a useless scatter across the floor. Hayes announced that Silas would be held pending a formal investigation into fraudulent dealings and threats tied to land across the county. The lawyer from Carson City sputtered objections, but the judge's stern look silenced him. Outside, the people of Red Rock parted in silence as the sheriff led Silas away. the dust rising like a curtain falling on a final act. Clara drew Lydia close. Jace lifted Eli into his arms, and for the first time in weeks, the children believed they might truly be safe. In the months that followed, Silas's name dwindled into a bitter cautionary tale. In the saloon, men muttered how greed had broken him, how he had chosen land over kin. At the mercantile, women shook their heads, remarking how Clara had done more for the children in a year than Silas had in his lifetime. Even Pastor Weller took to reminding his flock that the law without love is a shell without a soul. Red Rock, once divided between blood and compassion, began to see with clearer eyes. There were still some who whispered that blood should not be denied, but as the seasons turned, the laughter of children at Dry Creek Ranch softened even their doubts. Autumn painted the valley gold. Lydia gathered fallen leaves into piles and coaxed Eli to leap into them, his laughter carrying across the yard like music. Clara stood on the porch with her apron dusted in the flour, her dark braid loose, her eyes soft as she watched. Jace split logs by the barn, his muscles working with steady rhythm, pausing only when Eli tugged at his sleeve to beg for a try. Jace lifted the boy onto the axe handle, steadying his tiny hands, showing him how strength was not in force but in patience. Onyx grazed nearby, tossing his black mane, watching with eyes that seemed to mirror his master's protective calm. Winter was gentler than the last. Snow layered the rooftops and fences, but inside the ranch house there was warmth enough to forget the winds outside. Clara read stories aloud by the fire. Eli curled against her lap, while Lydia helped Jace mend tack, her slender fingers learning to braid leather as he guided her patiently. Onyx stood in the barn, steam rising from his breath, and sometimes Lydia crept out to brush him, speaking in hushed tones, as though the stallion alone could carry her secrets. In those moments, the horse lowered his head, eyes half closed, as if listening. Spring arrived with a chorus of life. Calves bawled in the pastures, chicks peeped beneath Clara's careful hands, and Eli chased after lambs with unsteady legs, falling often, but rising always with a grin. Jace taught him to ride, setting him on Onyx's back, while he held the reins steady, walking alongside with a hand firm on the boy's knee. Eli's face glowed with pride as he declared he was a cowboy too. Lydia watched from the fence, her smile proud, though later she whispered to Clara that she still dreamed of the desert, still feared someone might come again. Clara knelt and held her, stroking her hair, promising that nightmares lose power when shared. By summer, Dry Creek shone with renewal. One evening, neighbors gathered under the cottonwoods, lanterns strung like fallen stars, tables laden with food. Mrs. Patterson brought pies. Jenkins the blacksmith rolled in a barrel of cider. Even the sheriff arrived, his mustache bristling, but his smile uncharacteristically broad. Music floated from a fiddle, and the children danced barefoot in the dust. Eli scrambled onto Jace's shoulders, squealing with delight as Lydia twirled in a dress Clara had sewn, her laughter ringing pure as church bells. For Clara, who had once thought her home would never know joy again, it felt like the walls themselves breathed with life. For Jace, who had carried guilt and silence for years, it was proof that the desert had not claimed him, but given him a second chance. As the evening waned and the stars brightened above, Lydia slipped onto the porch beside Jace. She had grown taller, her hair brushing her shoulders, her gaze steadier than the frightened girl he had once lifted onto his horse. She leaned against his arm, her voice soft. "Pa, Jace, will we always be here, even when I'm grown?" He looked down at her, his weathered face lit by lantern light, and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Always," he said, voice rough but certain. "Home isn't fences or land. Home is where love keeps you, and you'll always be loved here." Eli ran up then, his cheeks flushed, clutching a sparkler that flickered against the night. He climbed into Clara's lap, breathless. "Mama Clara," he whispered, "no one can take us away now, right?" She wrapped her arms around him, pressing a kiss to his hair. "No one," she answered, her voice steady. "You are ours, and we are yours. That is what family means." The neighbors began to depart, their lanterns bobbing down the road until only the family remained. They sat together on the porch, the night air scented with wildflowers and bread, the stars scattered endless above. Onyx grazed in the pasture, lifting his head to whicker softly, as if to echo the peace that had settled over them. Jace held Eli against his chest. Clara rested her hand on Lydia's back, and together they let the quiet enfold them. It had been a year since the desert, a year since fear and loss had stalked two children across burning sands. Now the house was filled with laughter, the yard alive with voices, the land carrying not the weight of sorrow, but the promise of tomorrow. They were not bound by law nor by blood, but by something stronger. Lydia and Eli understood at last what the court had declared and what every day since had proven. Family is not written on paper, it is written in love. And in the stillness of that summer night at Dry Creek, they knew they were truly home. In the story of Jace, Clara, Lydia, and Eli, we are reminded of a truth that shines brighter than the desert sun. Family is not only born of blood, but of love, sacrifice, and the hand of God guiding hearts toward one another. Just as the Lord led two lost children out of the wilderness into a home filled with laughter, He also walks with each of us in our daily struggles, turning pain into hope, fear into faith, and loneliness into belonging. This tale teaches us that miracles are not always thunder and lightning. Sometimes they are quiet, like the steady hands of a man who refuses to give up, the gentle embrace of a woman who chooses to love again, or the laughter of children who learn that home is where God's love dwells. And if He can bring healing to Dry Creek, He can bring it to our lives too, wherever we are, whatever burdens we carry. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others. Leave a comment below with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next story of hope and redemption. Let us pray that God blesses every home represented here, filling it with love as He filled the hearts of this family. And if you believe in the power of His love, type Amen in the comments as a prayer together. May His grace be with you always.